Well, 1 Samuel 24 is a very peculiar passage. Some questions that come up as you read through, one being, why was the census such a problem? And what do we make also of God being the one who entices David to take the census? So these are some things that pop up in our minds as we read. Now, verse 1 indicates that Israel had already done something to arouse the Lord's anger. And so what transpired after this, the plague and all this, was really part of a much broader issue, which is not disclosed by the writer of 2 Samuel. A glance back, though, at the previous chapters might give us some indication and some insight into what is going on. There in the previous chapters, we see lists of names of David's mighty men and their victories and all of their various encounters with enemies and how they won and overcame them. And so as you read through those last few chapters, you get the sense that the kingdom under David's reign has been actually doing pretty well, that they are enjoying a prosperity and a certain sort of peace and of security that really poses a danger as well. And there's a warning that Moses gives in Deuteronomy chapter 8 that I think really they should have heeded during this time. And there in Deuteronomy 8, we read this: "Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I commanded you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers, as it is to this day." Now, this is somewhat speculative, but it may be that the hearts of the people and also the heart of David had become lifted up so that they forgot the Lord. Things are going well. David's got a strong army, got lots of mighty men around him. He's been given great victories. The people are doing well. There's prosperity. The census itself then would be consistent with this idea. This was a military census. This was a way for David to discern what sort of military might he had at his disposal. And so he wants to know how many fighting men he's got. It seems he's forgotten that it was not military might that actually got him to where he's at, but rather it was the might of the Lord that made it happen. David is king because God put him on the throne, not because David somehow found a way to make it happen on his own. Now, you recall back when Saul was pursuing David, David refused to take Saul's life, and this is why. David understood that it was not up to him to make it happen, that God would work it out in his own perfect timing. And this also protected David from being charged with any kind of conspiracy. Now, David trusted the Lord, and the Lord exalted David. But David seems to have forgotten this when he calls for the census. Despite Joab's questioning and comments that it was not a good idea, David insists and prevails. And so Joab goes and he sends out his men to go take a census, which took almost 10 months to take. And so the result of the census was this, that they had close to 1.3 million men that he could call upon to go to war should he need them. Now, just to compare this with our military today in the United States, I looked at some numbers, and the U.S. military, according to the one site that I looked at, said that there are about 1.2 million active duty military personnel today, and that's not including officers, and there's about 224,000 officers. And this is from all four branches of the U.S. military. Now, I'm guessing that was considered to be a lot in David's day, 1.3 million people, men specifically. Sounds like a lot. And so if it was a lot, then David probably found a great deal of security and pride in those numbers. He probably thought, "Wow, I've got quite an army," and so I'm feeling pretty confident now, and I'm feeling a lot of security and a lot of pride. Now, if those numbers, let's just say for discussion, if those numbers were actually low on the low end, if this revealed that he had a small army, which I don't think it was. But even then, he may have suddenly felt very vulnerable and weak. So either way, I think that he came to realize something, that his trust was misplaced. His heart, it says, there was struck, and he realizes then how foolish it was for him to even do this. He had forgotten what Psalm 33 says, that the king is not saved by his great army, a warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a false hope for salvation, and by its great might it cannot rescue. So this gives us an insight into what may have been the reason why this census was a problem. But God was the one who enticed David to do it, so we still have to deal with that issue. How do we reconcile what 2 Samuel says here with what James 1:13 says? James says there, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." Now, aren't we facing a contradiction here in Scripture then, if one passage says that God enticed David to do it, and another says that God does not do these sorts of things? He does not tempt anyone to do anything? No, we're not really dealing with a contradiction, just an apparent contradiction. James is correct. God does not tempt anyone. But here's what we do understand, is that God does permit Satan to tempt people. That God does permit Satan to afflict people. We see this in the book of Job. God did not directly afflict Job, but Satan did get permission from God to afflict Job. So we find also in 1 Chronicles, which has many and contains many of the same stories as 1 and 2 Samuel, we find this same story appearing there in 1 Chronicles 21. Now it's interesting that the chronicler actually says that it was Satan that enticed David to take a census. So which is it? Well, really it was both. Both are true, and from different points of view. It seems very clear that God allowed Satan to tempt David to take the census, that this was permitted by God. So it seems that maybe we could say the devil made David do it. Is that what we're looking at here? Not exactly. Let me again look at what James says in the following verses. James 1:14 through 15 says this: "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." You know, the truth of the matter is we don't need a lot of help from Satan in order to do the wrong thing and make poor choices and to sin against the Lord. Our sin in our own hearts, our own corruption of our flesh, is fully capable of finding ways to sin against the Lord on our own. So certainly David didn't need Satan's help to do this, but certainly Satan, it seems, was involved, and God had permitted it for his own purposes. And it also appears that David's decision to issue this census follows the pattern in James perfectly, since death by pestilence was certainly the result of the census. But again, we must remember that it really began in David's heart, despite the enticing by Satan. David was free in all of his choices. He willingly and freely chose to do this. Now, some things to discuss for your small group time. First, how have our own hearts perhaps fallen into the same trap? How have our own hearts at times in our lives become lifted up? Perhaps even right now. Perhaps we are coming to realize that our own hearts have been lifted up, thinking to ourselves that somehow we are the ones to congratulate for our successes and for our progress in life. Perhaps that we've done well. Perhaps we've experienced wonderful blessings from the Lord, and so we want to take credit for that. That's a very common thing for us. So in what ways have we done this very same thing and forgotten the Lord? What sort of worldly things make us feel secure and proud? And the second thing would be, what did the Lord do to remind David and his people that they are dependent upon him? And what about you? What sorts of things has God brought into your life to remind you of your complete and total dependence upon the Lord? How has he sort of shaken your dependence on self, and helped you to see that your trust is misplaced? And the third thing would be this, and this gets into the end of the story, this event that we're looking at. For there at the end, David intercedes on behalf of the people who are suffering as a result of this plague. Now remember, even though David says, hey, I'm the one that sinned, these people are innocent, it does say that the Lord was already angry with Israel. And so there were other things going on, there were other things happening that are not revealed in 2 Samuel. And God doesn't feel any obligation to reveal what those were. All we need to know was there were other things happening. But there we see David intercedes on behalf of the people, saying to the Lord, let your hand fall on me and my family. Now, how do David's actions here give us insight into the work of Christ? In what sense was his request fulfilled by Christ on the cross? So that's all I have for this week. So may God bless you in your reading of his word.